there's a new path, right? We didn't have this before. We didn't have this a decade ago. I mean, up until the last 5 years, the world was like academics or private sector, and private sector meant pharma. That's not so true anymore. Today, private sector could be biotech, it can be tech, startup. I mean, there's lots of opportunity there. And I think for people in training and people in Brainstorm, they ought to be thinking about either joining those companies or starting those companies, because that's where a lot of opportunity is right now.
Hey, it's Dr. Cody Rall with Techforpsych. I've got a very special episode for you guys today. I'm interviewing Dr. Tom Insel, which is definitely a landmark for this channel. For those of you who don't know, Dr. Insel was head of the National Institute of Mental Health for 13 years. His TED Talk on the crucial need to reframe mental health diagnoses into brain disorders has over 1 million views. He's made national headlines over the last couple of years as he's transitioned from work at NIMH to do a startup called Mindstrong, which is doing very interesting analyses of smartphone data for mental health diagnoses. His future vision of neuroscience helped convince me that this is what I wanted to do with my career, so naturally it was amazing to sit down and talk with him about several topics, including the latest developments at Mindstrong. Dr. Tom Insel, what can I say? Thanks so much for doing this, really appreciate it.
Happy to be here, Cody. I've heard about this effort for 2 years at least, so it's good to be part of it.
The growth has been crazy. From year to year, it's just gotten bigger and bigger, and having you here is very nice as well. You were the director of NIMH for 13 years. It's amazing when I look at your talks from NIMH and talking about changing the way that we do mental health, the way that we diagnose and treat mental health. Could you talk just a little bit about where mental health is headed?
Yeah, I mean, the perspective from NIMH is very different from the perspective of someone who may be at the APA or someone who's in the front lines of mental health care. NIMH is a research funding organization, and it's got the benefit of a very generous public that provides $1.6 billion a year to invest in science, and it's trying to choose the best science to give us a deeper understanding of mental illness. So it's a wonderful opportunity. What an incredible role to be able to be in that world where you kind of like a venture capitalist, except you're using public money, and instead of looking at a return on investment based on dollars, you're looking at a return on investment based on insight, based on getting better data to get deeper understanding of, what is schizophrenia all about? What's the risk architecture of autism? What's the next best way to diagnose and treat depression? So I think that's a great, fantastic opportunity. I did it, as you said, for 13 years. I think I spent about $20 billion in that period. But there were two things I started to realize. One was that I had been showing some of the same slides for a long time. And one of them was a slide that said, we're still at the beginning, we're not ready to actually deliver yet, but in 10 years, this will change everything. I've been saying that for 10 years, and it still hadn't delivered. The other problem I began to feel was that the long-term promise of this kind of genomics, neuroscience, and even diagnostic and treatment research didn't match the urgency of what patients and families were feeling. I often tell the story that I was giving a talk someplace on the West Coast to a group of family members, and after showing them all this beautiful work on stem cells and epigenetics and the work on genomic architecture, someone got up and said, our house is on fire and you're talking about the chemistry of the paint. So I did begin to feel like, how do I start to put out the fire? This is not something that I want to wait another 10 years to see how it plays out. So part of what drew me from being in public sector to private sector, from being in academic research to the tech sector, from thinking about molecules and neuroimaging to thinking about technology and information science, was saying maybe in the same way that technology had disrupted so much of what we do in retail, in commerce, in the way that we book transportation or book a hotel room, maybe it's time to ask, can we disrupt mental health care? Not science per se, but the way in which we diagnose and treat and engage people with mental illness. And maybe not in 10 years, but in 2 years, can we begin to really move the needle? We hadn't done that after a pretty big investment on the research side through NIMH. I think it still will.
Yeah.
I'm not dissing that approach. I think we need that. We need the marathon, but somebody also needs to be able to run the sprint. Patients and families are looking for the sprinter, and maybe technology can serve that role.
And in your talk this morning, you talked about transitioning to Silicon Valley, that you didn't have your hoodie and you didn't, it was a whole new culture for you. And I was curious what that was like going from, there in Bethesda at NIH to, moving to Palo Alto and connecting with that part of the country. What was that like?
Yeah, I mean, changes on lots of levels. So public to private, certainly, from kind of biological research to tech. And frankly, from being in a world where most of the people were my age or close to my age, to being in a world where everybody was younger than my children, that was probably the biggest shock of all. It took some adjustment. I don't have a background in coding. I don't have a background in machine learning. Sort of the fundamentals that one needs today in a tech company were completely foreign to me. And at first I thought, well, I can learn this stuff. Actually, I can't. I mean, I'm at a stage where I wasn't hired by Verily or by Mindstrong to code. There are other people who can do that much better. I'm not on the data science team in either company, but what I think the tech world needs, and I think it's something that people who are part of this innovation zone should understand, is that tech by itself is not going to make a difference unless it's grounded in the problems that clinicians have to face and that patients and families care about. So what many tech companies need is not just more data science, more design, or more software engineers. They need someone who understands the problems that have to be solved. And that's non-trivial. We actually have to think about, how does a piece of software fit into the workflow of a private practice in primary care or in specialty care? Or how does being able to do digital phenotyping really matter to anybody, whether that's a patient, a family, or a provider?
What's your sense of these companies, the tech companies, in terms of their access to clinical experts? Are they able to find experts? And how many clinicians are really involved in the process from what you've seen?
Yeah, they definitely need that. They are able to usually bring in some clinical expertise. What they often don't have is access to clinical populations. So it's not just a matter of having a psychiatrist and a psychologist on staff, which most of them more or less have. Sometimes very good people, sometimes people fairly early in their career. That's maybe necessary, it's not sufficient. They also need to be engaged with a provider group or with some place where they can begin to work quickly and iteratively with a clinical population. You've got to remember, this is really different than developing a drug where you engage a CRO, they recruit patients over 18 months or 2 years, you do a study that runs for another 2 years, you get the data and you spend 2 years looking at it. That's not the way we do software development.
Yeah.
Software development, you push something out, we call it dog fooding, you give it to friends and family, you get results right away, you decide what's working, what isn't, you iterate on that and make it better, then you go to a larger group of people, post dog food, to maybe 100 people, you learn very quickly, and then you just move up scale that way until pretty soon you're deploying this in thousands and soon millions of people. It's not the world of drug development, and this requires both clinical insight on the team, but also clinical populations that you can engage quickly.
And it sounds like at Mindstrong you guys are kind of approaching that stage from what I've heard, correct? Where you're able to start talking more about, we've tried this on this amount of people and these are the results we're getting. Is that where you guys are kind of at, or is it still moving forward?
Yeah, Mindstrong is super cool. I mean, when it started, it was a self-funded company that Paul Dagum developed coming out of cybersecurity. And he just asked the simple question of whether using this kind of digital fingerprinting, totally passive, collecting lots of smartphone data in terms of how you type, not what you type, but doing that in a bunch of people who you then characterize with gold standard neurocognitive batteries. Could you find features that would map onto those batteries? And gosh, he found that. So based on that, the company launched, and what it did in the first year was to deploy in lots of clinical studies: depression, PTSD, schizophrenia. I think we got enough data from that first year to say, this is interesting. It's not only important for looking at neurocognitive traits, but we can use this to map and follow clinical states. So gosh, this looks like it gives us a pretty good readout about how people are doing when they're being treated for ketamine or when they're at risk for PTSD. Can we now ramp this up to a larger population? And we're right in the middle of that process. So going initially from small group neurocognition, larger group clinical trials, including with neuroimaging, and now looking at much larger provider-based or payer-based studies to get insights from now thousands of people so that we can get insights that are clinically actionable. And that's really where we're in the middle of that.
Yeah, I remember that slide you showed this morning on ketamine. There was like the activity before and after a ketamine treatment. And I was just like, oh my gosh, it's amazing to see that it's right there. You got the data and that it's tracking something,
It is, and at first when I saw that I thought, oh gosh, this is like hard to believe. But then you begin to realize that increasingly we live on our phones. That's a sad statement in a sense, but we can take advantage of that for people with depression in this case, to say, what's that information and how can we use that information to help you manage your depression or help a care manager to know when you're about to relapse. We've done such a poor job in this field with measurement. We just don't measure well. And providing a passive, continuous, ubiquitous platform like this that can give us objective measures of whether someone's on the road to recovery or relapse, I think it can really help, if only to tell a care manager it's time to make a phone call or it's time to alert somebody instead of waiting to when they show up in the emergency room.
I wanted to ask this morning actually, because we use our smartphones so much, but are you guys taking a look at wearables as well, or is it just too big of a problem to try to tackle at this point to bring in even more data?
So some of the studies we're doing with Fitbit, where we've got that wearable. So the Aurora study looking at predictors of PTSD in people who have been seen in a level 1 trauma center. So in this case, thousands of people, 5,000 people, all victims of trauma. That's our start. So once they've had a traumatic event, we follow them then for a couple of years, trying to identify what are the signals that will precede the development of PTSD. About 1 in 5 will develop PTSD. So there we've got the Fitbit data as well as Mindstrong data. I'm sorry, it's not Fitbit. In that case, it's the Verily watch. So we've got Verily data and Mindstrong data to help use as predictors. We've got other studies with Fitbit, like with the Michigan intern study, and there'll be some others. I think the wearables are powerful in terms of the quality of the signal. The problem that's bedeviled the wearable field is that people stop wearing. It's been difficult to get people to continue to engage with that. And I don't think we've solved that. The value of having something that is in your phone, it's passive, that it doesn't require you to do anything different than what you would do if you're using your phone every day, is that you've got the engagement baked in. And that's a huge advantage in this field.
Yeah, luckily we're so addicted to our phones that we have them on our all the time.
I mean, it raises the question, is this the problem or is it the solution? And my argument is that it might be both.
One last question I just wanted to ask about like what your thoughts are on role of academia in this and kind of like introducing innovation. We got Stanford Brainstorm going. I have to put in a plug for that a little bit. Thank you for being an advisor. And so yeah, what do you see like a role of academia there in terms of like incubating new ideas, new companies, and sort of having access to patients and resources to actually make things happen?
Latter probably more than the former. I think you can incubate some great ideas in academia, but for the development of software, it takes more than ideas. You need to have designers, you need to have data scientists, you need to have access to populations, which you might have in academia sometimes, not always. But most of all, if you want to have an impact, you've got to be able to scale. And academia doesn't scale the way the private sector can scale. You know, at Google, we used to say that success is measured by engaging 1 billion people. And until you've got 1 billion people, and Google has 7 products used by 1 billion people every day, until you get to that point, you're a work in progress, right? Academics, it's been hard for them to be able to think about working at that scale. Frankly, for mental health, that's the kind of thinking we need. We need people who are willing to say, hey, I'm wanting to create value for 10 million people, not for 10 to 20 people. And unfortunately, academics have been at that 10 to 20 scale without understanding, you know, what the value proposition would need to be for this to be adopted by millions or billions. That's the nature of the problem, though. So I think where academics can be helpful are, to some extent, the early development of concepts and ideas, and maybe, you know, reaching out a bit to from psychiatry to, let's say, the Department of Linguistics to the Department of Engineering and Computer Science to create teams that might be kind of interesting. That is where a lot of good ideas have gotten started. I think that's great. They probably need to launch from there to something that will scale better. But the other place will be as partners in the actual testing of ideas because of the access to clinical populations. And that may be especially true for rare diseases or for uncommon situations. That could be anorexia nervosa, it could be suicide, it could be areas where we've got a really big public health problem. And you may have to go to an academic population to be able to nail it. So I think that's where the opportunity is for kind of a partnership between private sector and public sector.
Awesome. Well, I really appreciate you talking with me today. Thank you for your time. Anything else that you wanted to cover?
No, I think that the brainstorm idea is great. So getting people, particularly residents and trainees, to realize there's a new path, right? We didn't have this before. We didn't have this a decade ago. I mean, up until the last 5 years, the world was like academics or private sector, and private sector meant pharma. That's not so true anymore. Today, private sector could be biotech, it can be tech, startup. I mean, there's lots of opportunity there. And I think for people in training and people in brainstorm, they ought to be thinking about either joining those companies or starting those companies, because that's where a lot of opportunity is right now. Maybe actually more than what you're going to find in the traditional academic sector, which is dependent on NIH funding, which isn't growing at the pace that we're seeing the tech sector grow.
It's an exciting time to be in the field for sure. I don't know what it was like 20 or 30 years ago, but as a resident, or someone that just finished residency and coming into doing this type of innovation here at the APA, or working with Stanford Brainstorm, or doing my thing on YouTube, it's all just been a whirlwind of learning and excitement. So it's been really fun.
Glad you can be part of it.
Yeah. Thank you.
Thank you.